Captain Threk Dassin had seen a lot of dead systems in his life. He had flown past burned-out stars, drifted through fields of broken moons, and walked the empty halls of cities left behind by races that no longer existed. But nothing had prepared him for the silence of the system his ship was now entering. The ship was called the Long Reach, a salvage vessel built for one purpose: to find things other people had thrown away and sell them to people who wanted them back. It was not a warship. It was not fast, or strong, or well-armed. It had a few old cannons bolted to the hull for scaring off pirates, and that was all. But it had good sensors, a strong cargo hold, and a captain who knew how to find value where others saw only trash. Threk was a Kethran, a species that had only been flying between stars for a few hundred years. His people were not the strongest race in the galaxy, or the smartest, or the richest, but they were patient, and they were careful, and they were very good at noticing things that other people missed. That was how Threk had found the star charts that led him here. He had bought them from a dying trader on a backwater station, an old being who claimed the charts came from a species called the Makers, or the First Ones, a name that changed depending on who was telling the story. The charts were old, older than anything Threk had ever seen, written in a strange but readable format, like someone had wanted them to be found. They marked a system with a single yellow star, 3 rocky planets, and 1 blue world in what the old maps called the safe zone, the perfect distance from the sun for water to stay liquid. The charts had a name for the blue world too. They called it Earth. Threk had heard old stories about Earth, the way every spacefaring race eventually heard old stories about Earth. Some races said humans had never existed, and the stories were just old myths, made up to scare children. Others said humans had existed once, a violent and clever species that built machines beyond anyone's understanding, and then vanished overnight, wiped out by some enemy or curse or disease that nobody living remembered. Still others swore that humans were still out there somewhere, hiding, waiting. Threk did not believe or disbelieve any of it. He was a salvager. He believed in what he could see with his own sensors and hold in his own hands, and what his sensors were showing him right now, as the Long Reach dropped out of its jump and slid into the yellow star's gravity well, was making every instinct in his body stand up straight and pay attention. "Captain," said Selavor, his first officer, from the seat beside him, "you need to see this." Sela was younger than Threk, sharp-eyed, quick to notice details that others missed. She had been with him for 6 years, ever since her own ship had been taken apart by pirates, and she had needed new work. She did not scare easily, but her voice right now had an edge to it that Threk did not like. "I'm looking at it," Threk said quietly. On the main screen, the long-range scan was filling in, piece by piece, like a picture being painted stroke by stroke. At first, Threk thought it was an asteroid field. There were hundreds of shapes out past the third planet, clustered together in loose formations, drifting slowly around the star. But asteroids did not have straight edges. Asteroids did not have engine ports and weapon turrets and hulls built in matching patterns. These were ships. Not one ship, not 10 ships. Threk counted, lost count, and counted again. The number kept climbing past 100, past 200, past anything he had ever seen gathered in one place outside of a major shipyard. And these were not small ships either. Even at this distance, the scale readings told him some of these hulls stretched for kilometers. Long gray shapes bristling with weapon housings, docking arms, sensor arrays, and defensive plating that looked thick enough to survive a small star-going nova. "Dorn," Threk called into the comm. "Get up here. Now." Dorn Cade, the ship's engineer, arrived on the bridge less than a minute later, still wiping grease from his hands onto his coveralls. He took one look at the screen and stopped moving entirely. "That's a fleet," Dorn said. "I can see that," Threk said. "No, Captain, I mean, look at the formation. Look at how they're spread out. That's not a junkyard. That's not ships that got left somewhere and forgot. Someone parked that fleet on purpose. Someone organized it." Threk leaned forward, studying the pattern on the screen. Dorn was right. The ships were not scattered randomly, the way debris scattered after a battle or an accident. They sat in neat rows and columns, spread out just far enough that a collision would be impossible even after centuries of small drift, arranged by size and type, smaller ships closer to the star, larger ones further out, with a small cluster of truly massive vessels sitting almost exactly at the center of the whole formation. "How many," Sella asked, "do you think are out there?" Dorn ran the numbers through the ship's computer, cross-referencing the scan data. It took almost a full minute for the answer to come back, and when it did, even Dorn looked uneasy. "Best guess, based on the density of contacts and the size of the formation, somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 vessels." Nobody spoke for a long moment. The Long Reaches bridge, small as it was, suddenly felt very quiet and very small. "That can't be right," Sella said. "The assembly doesn't have 6,000 warships," Dorn said. "The whole Kethran fleet, every warship we've ever built, all of them together, doesn't add up to 6,000 ships. Nobody has a fleet that size. Nobody we've ever heard of." Threk kept staring at the screen, at the neat, orderly rows of ships stretching out across the darkness, like a graveyard, built with too much care to be an accident. He thought about the old stories again, the ones about a violent, clever species that had vanished overnight. "Passive scans only," Threk said. "No active sensors. No transmissions. I want us quiet as a held breath until we know what we're looking at." "You think it's still active?" Sella asked. "After all this time?" Threk didn't answer right away. He looked at the long-range readings again, the way the ships drifted with no visible power signatures, no heat blooms, no sign of engines running or reactors online. Everything about the fleet said dead, said abandoned, said empty. And yet something in his gut told him to be careful anyway. "I don't know what we're looking at," he said finally. "That's exactly why we're going to be careful." They spent the better part of 2 days simply watching, before Threk allowed the ship to move any closer. He wanted to understand the shape of what they had found, before he risked getting close enough for it to notice them back, if there was anything left in that fleet capable of noticing anything at all. The passive scans painted a picture slowly, piece by piece. The fleet was old, not old in the way a used cargo hauler was old, with a few decades of wear on its hull, old in a way that suggested centuries, maybe longer, of sitting untouched in the emptiness of space. Fine layers of dust and micrometeorite damage covered every surface. Some of the smaller ships near the edges of the formation had clearly taken minor hits over the years, tiny impacts that had chipped paint and dented plating, but never broken through the hulls. And yet, despite all that time, the ships had not fallen apart. They had not drifted out of formation. They had not become the kind of scattered wreckage that centuries of neglect usually left behind. Whatever had built this fleet had built it to last, and whatever had arranged it in these neat rows had done so with the kind of precision that spoke of careful planning, not panic or defeat. "This wasn't a battle," Sella said, on the second day, looking over the data they had gathered. "If this fleet had been destroyed in a fight, we'd see damage everywhere. Broken hulls, debris fields, ships torn apart. But look at this. Every ship is basically whole. Every ship is in its assigned spot. This is a fleet that was put here, parked, on purpose. Which means somebody meant to come back for it," Dorn said. "Or somebody wanted it kept safe until they needed it again," Threk said. The thought sat uneasily in the room. A fleet this size, kept in reserve, waiting, for what, for how long, and by whom? On the third day, Threk finally gave the order to move closer, but slowly, and only toward the outer edge of the formation, where the smaller ships sat. He wanted to start with something manageable. If the fleet truly was as dead as it looked, a small scout vessel at the edge would tell them everything they needed to know without putting the whole ship at risk. The Long Reach eased forward through the darkness, its engines running at the barest whisper of power, sensors soaking in every detail as they approached. The nearest ship grew larger and larger on the view screen, until it filled the whole frame, a long gray shape with sweeping lines and rows of dark viewports, utterly still, utterly silent. Up close, the design was strange to Threk's eyes, and yet somehow also familiar, the way a face from a story you'd heard as a child might feel familiar, even if you had never actually seen it. The hull plating was arranged in overlapping layers, like scales, or like feathers, built for both strength and a kind of grim beauty that Threk had not expected from a warship. Weapon emplacements dotted the surface in careful patterns, some of them clearly designed for close combat, others built for striking targets from far away. Docking ports and access hatches sat at regular intervals, all of them sealed tight. And on the hull, near what looked like the front of the ship, painted in letters that had faded but not vanished, were markings, symbols, a language Threk had never seen before, sharp and angular, arranged in neat rows. "Can the translator make anything of that?" Threk asked. Dorn ran the image through the ship's language database, the vast library of alphabets and symbols the Long Reach had collected over years of trading with 100 different species. The computer searched and came back with nothing. "No match," Dorn said. "Whatever language that is, we've never encountered it before. Not even a partial match." "Try the old stories," Sella said quietly. "The ones about Earth. Wasn't there supposed to be a language associated with them? English, or something like that?" Dorn tried again, pulling from an older, less reliable set of archives, fragments of information collected from other races over the years, half legend and half history. This time the computer found something. A weak match, an old fragment of a language called English, pieced together from scraps other races had recorded generations ago, back when the stories about Earth were fresher, and more people still remembered enough to write them down. The markings on the hull weren't a perfect match, but they were close. Close enough that the computer offered a rough guess at a translation. The word on the hull, more likely than not, was a name, a ship's name. Defiant. Nobody on the bridge said anything for a while. "So it's real," Sella finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Earth was real. Humans were real. Threk found himself looking at the long, silent shape of the Defiant, hanging in space before them, thinking about all the stories he had heard over the years, and never quite believed. A species that built machines beyond understanding. A species that had simply vanished. "Real or not," Threk said slowly, "somebody built these ships. Somebody parked them here, in formation, on purpose. And somebody has to know they're here." "You think humans are still around somewhere?" Dorn asked. "I think," Threk said, "that we need to be very, very careful about what we do next." Despite his own words, caution slowly gave way to curiosity, and curiosity slowly gave way to something else, the simple, undeniable pull of opportunity. Threk was a salvager. He had spent his whole career finding value in places other people had abandoned, and here, spread out before him, was more value than he had ever seen in one place in his entire life. 6,000 ships, even if only a fraction of them still held anything usable, represented more wealth than the Long Reach could carry in 100 lifetimes. He told himself he was still being careful. He kept the ship's active sensors off. He kept communications silent. He sent Dorn and Sella out in a small shuttle, rather than risking the Long Reach itself, to physically dock with the Defiant and see what they could learn from the inside. The shuttle ride across the gap between the Long Reach and the Defiant took only a few minutes, but to Sella, sitting in the pilot's seat with Dorn beside her checking equipment readings, it felt much longer. The closer they got, the larger the warship became, until it filled the entire forward window, an enormous gray wall stretching up and down and to either side farther than she could see. "Docking port ahead," Dorn said, checking his scanner. "Looks intact. No visible damage." "Any power readings at all?" Sella asked. "Nothing. Ship's completely cold. No heat signatures, no active systems, nothing on the reactor cores. If there's power anywhere on this thing, it's buried so deep my scanner can't find it." Sella eased the shuttle up alongside the docking port, matching the ship's slow drift, and extended the docking clamp. It caught, with a small mechanical thump that seemed unnaturally loud in the silence of space. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the ancient outer door of the Defiant's airlock began to grind open, powered by some kind of manual backup system, releasing a small puff of frozen atmosphere that sparkled briefly in the starlight, before dissolving into nothing. "Well," Dorn said, staring at the open door, "I guess it wants visitors." They suited up carefully, checking their gear twice, and made their way across the short connecting tube into the Defiant's airlock. The inner door took longer to open, groaning against centuries of disuse, but eventually it gave way, and they stepped through into the ship itself. The corridor beyond was dark, lit only by the beams of their suit lights, and utterly still. Dust hung in the air where there should have been none, disturbed by their entry, and now drifting slowly in the absence of gravity. The walls were lined with panels and readouts, all dark, all silent, covered in more of the same sharp, angular writing they had seen on the hull outside. "This place is huge," Sela said. Her voice hushed even though there was no reason to whisper. "I mean, I knew it would be big, but it's built for a crew," Dorn said, shining his light down a side corridor lined with doors. "Look at that. Quarters. Dozens of them, just on this level. This isn't some automated drone ship. This was built to carry people." They moved deeper into the ship, following the main corridor toward what their scanners suggested was the command section. Everything they passed told the same story. A vessel built with enormous care, meant to house and support a crew for long periods of time, filled with systems whose purpose Dorn could only guess at. Some rooms held rows of what looked like sleeping berths. Others held racks of equipment that might have been weapons, or might have been tools, impossible to tell without power to activate them. And everywhere, that same dust, undisturbed for what must have been centuries, coating every surface in a fine gray layer. "It's like a tomb," Sela murmured. "Or a museum," Dorn said. "Whichever it is, whoever left it here wanted it kept exactly as it was. Look at how orderly everything is. No damage, no looting, nothing broken. This ship has been sitting here for who knows how long, and nobody's touched it." They reached the command section eventually, a wide chamber filled with rows of dark control stations arranged around a central platform. Even powered down, even coated in dust and shadow, there was something imposing about the room, something that made Sela's suit lights feel small and thin against the darkness pressing in from every side. Dorn moved to the nearest console and ran a careful scan, checking for any trace of active power before touching anything. The readings came back the same as everywhere else on the ship. Nothing. Cold. Dead. "I want to try something," Dorn said. "There's a manual access port here. This kind of thing usually has some form of backup power source, even after all this time. Batteries built to last. Let me see if I can get anything to respond." "Careful," Sela said. Dorn connected a small portable power cell from his own gear to the console's access port, a trick salvagers used all the time on old dead machinery. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, a single light on the console flickered to life, dim and orange, followed by another, and another, until a small section of the console glowed weakly in the darkness. Both of them held their breath. The console's small display flickered, static-filled at first, and then resolved into a string of the same sharp, angular text they had seen throughout the ship. Dorn ran it immediately through his suit's translator, cross-referencing against the fragments of the old human language they had found before. The rough translation crawled across his display a moment later, words appearing slowly, one at a time. "System status, standby, awaiting authorization, Fleet Guardian protocol active." Sela read the words twice, before she found her voice again. "Dorn," she said quietly, "I think we need to leave, right now." But even as she said it, deep in the ship around them, and out across the vast silent formation of thousands of warships hanging in the emptiness of space, something had already begun to change. It was small at first. A whisper of power moving through systems that had been silent for longer than either of them could imagine. A single spark, deep in the heart of one massive ship near the center of the formation, the ship the others seemed to orbit like planets around a star. Neither of them saw it happen. But somewhere out there, in the cold and the dark, after centuries of perfect stillness, the first engine had begun, very slowly, to hum back to life. Sela and Dorn made it back to the shuttle in record time, moving faster than either of them thought was possible in bulky vacuum suits. Neither of them spoke until the airlock had sealed behind them, and the shuttle had pulled away from the Defiant hull, putting a comfortable stretch of empty space between themselves and the dark warship. "Fleet Guardian protocol," Sela said, once she trusted her voice not to shake. "What does that even mean?" "I don't know," Dorn admitted, "but it doesn't sound like a friendly welcome message." They reported everything to Threk the moment they were back aboard the Longreach. Laying out the console readings, the translation, the strange quiet hum they thought they had felt through the deck plating right before they left, though neither of them could be completely sure they hadn't imagined it. Threk listened to all of it without interrupting, his four eyes narrowing slightly as the report went on. A habit Sela had learned meant he was thinking hard about something he didn't like. "So the ship is not actually dead," Threk said, once they had finished. "It's asleep, and you woke part of it up." "Only a small part," Dorn said. "A console. Barely anything. It's probably still mostly powered down, but if there's a backup power system strong enough to wake a console after centuries of doing nothing, then whatever the ship's main systems look like when they wake up, that's a different story entirely." Threk stood from his chair and paced the small bridge, something he did when he needed to think. Outside the viewport, the vast dark shape of the fleet still hung motionless, thousands of ships arranged in their careful rows, showing no outward sign that anything had changed at all. "We should leave," Sela said. "Right now, jump out, put distance between us and this system, and never come back." "And leave behind the most valuable find of my entire career?" Threk asked, though there was less conviction in his voice than usual. "Captain, that console said Fleet Guardian Protocol." "That doesn't sound like a shopping catalog. That sounds like a defense system." "A defense system that's been sitting here for centuries without doing anything," Threk pointed out. "If it were going to wake up and attack every ship that got close, it would have done that to us the moment we entered the system. We've been sitting here for 3 days. Nothing has moved. Nothing has fired. Whatever that console meant, it isn't some kind of instant alarm trigger." Dorn frowned, thinking it over. Maybe it's a threshold system, something that only responds once certain conditions are met. Scans not triggering it because passive scans don't cross whatever line it's watching for. But direct interaction, a manual connection to one of its systems, that might be different. "So we stop touching things," Threk said. "We observe from a distance instead. Slow, careful, passive collection only." "And if it's already too late?" Sela asked. "If that spark we felt was the whole fleet waking up, slowly, right now, while we're having this conversation?" Nobody had an answer for that. They sat with the question for a long moment, the low hum of the long reach systems the only sound on the bridge, until Threk finally broke the silence. "We watch," he said, "for 1 full day. If nothing changes, if the fleet stays quiet, we go back to careful, distant salvage. We don't board another ship. We don't touch another console. We map what we can see from range, and if this really is the find of the century, we do it the smart way, not the greedy way." Nobody argued with that plan. The day passed slowly, every hour stretching longer than the last, as the crew of the Long Reach watched their sensors for the smallest sign of change. Threk barely slept. Sela ran the same diagnostic sweeps over and over, checking and rechecking the fleet's power signatures for anything new. Dorn spent most of his time buried in the ship's language database, trying to build a better translation matrix from the fragments they had collected, hoping that a deeper understanding of the human language might help them understand what they were truly dealing with. By the end of the first day, nothing had changed. The fleet remained as still and silent as it had been when they first arrived. No new power signatures, no engine activity, no sign that the small spark Dorn had triggered inside the Defiant had spread anywhere else. "Maybe it really was just a local response," Sela said, studying the readings with something like relief in her voice. "A single system waking up because we plugged directly into it, and nothing more. Maybe the rest of the fleet really is just dead, old, abandoned. No guardian, no protocol, just leftover programming that doesn't actually do anything anymore." Threk wanted to believe that. Every part of him that had spent a lifetime chasing salvage wanted very badly to believe that. But something about the words on that console kept nagging at him, a stubborn splinter of doubt he couldn't quite shake loose. "I want to try something different," Threk said, on the morning of the second day. "Instead of boarding another ship, I want to try communication." "Communication with what?" Dorn asked. "There's nobody here to talk to." "There's a console that responded to a small amount of power with a coherent status message," Threk said. "That's not just leftover programming running in a loop. That's a system capable of processing information and producing a relevant response. If it can do that, maybe it can do more. Maybe it can answer questions." Sela looked uneasy. "You want to talk to the thing that might be the reason this fleet still has teeth?" "I want to understand what we're dealing with before we decide what to do about it," Threk said. "Right now we're guessing. I'd rather know." It took the better part of a day to prepare. Dorn built a small, self-contained transmitter unit, something that could be attached to the Defiant's hull without requiring anyone to go back inside, designed to send a simple, low-power signal using the fragments of the human language they had translated so far, along with a set of basic mathematical and scientific concepts that any technological species should be able to recognize, a kind of universal handshake meant to say, simply, "We mean no harm, we would like to speak." Dorn and Sella made the trip back to the Defiant. Together, moving carefully, attaching the small transmitter to an access panel near the hull's exterior sensor array, rather than risking another walk through the ship's interior. Then they retreated back to the long reach, and Threk gave the order to activate the device. The signal went out, a simple, repeating pattern, translated as best they could into the fragments of English they had gathered, along with basic symbols for peace, for questions, for a desire to understand. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the Defiant's hull lights, dark since they had first arrived, flickered once, and stayed on. "Captain," Sella said, her voice tight, "we've got a response." The response, when it came, was not what any of them expected. It didn't come as another status message on some console screen. It came as a full transmission, directed straight at the long reach. Using a translation protocol so smooth and complete that it took Dorn a moment to realize the ship itself must have been quietly listening to every word they had spoken over the past several days, cross-referencing their own language against some vast internal library, building its own understanding of Kethrin's speech, long before they had managed to translate even a fraction of its own. The voice that came through their comm system was calm, level, and entirely without warmth. It did not sound angry. It did not sound welcoming either. It sounded, more than anything, like something very old, that had been waiting a very long time, and was finally getting around to a task it had been assigned centuries ago. "Unidentified vessel," the voice said. "You have made contact with Fleet Reserve Command, designation Sol Guardian Network. Please state your designation, your point of origin, and your intent." For a long moment, nobody on the bridge of the long reach said anything at all. "Threk," Sella finally whispered. "That's not a recording. That's answering us. In real time." Threk swallowed hard, gathered himself, and leaned toward the comm. "This is Captain Threk Dassin, of the salvage vessel. Long Reach. Representing the Kethrin people. We came here following old star charts. We did not know this system was occupied, or guarded. We mean no harm." There was a pause, long enough that Threk began to wonder if the connection had failed. Then the voice returned. "Acknowledged, Captain Dassin. Threat assessment in progress. Please remain in your current position, and refrain from further contact with fleet vessels until assessment is complete." "Threat assessment," Sella repeated quietly. "Of us. How long will this assessment take?" Threk asked. "Assessment duration is variable," the voice replied. "Historical average, when applicable data exists, is between 1 and 3 standard days. Please note that any attempt to depart the system before assessment is complete, or any hostile action against fleet vessels or fleet personnel, will result in immediate escalation to active defense protocols." Threk closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing that. "And if we simply wait here, cooperate, and answer your questions honestly? Then this assessment will proceed as designed," the voice said. The Sol Guardian Network was constructed to distinguish between hostile intent and non-hostile intent among all parties who discover this fleet reserve. Cooperation improves assessment accuracy and reduces the likelihood of an unfavorable outcome. "Unfavorable outcome," Dorn muttered under his breath, not quite quiet enough. "Unfavorable outcomes include, but are not limited to," the voice continued, apparently having heard him anyway, "attempted theft of fleet assets, attempted sabotage of fleet systems, attempted unauthorized access to classified data, and any action determined to represent a threat to the fleet, to Earth, or to any future return of authorized personnel." Threk exchanged a look with Sella and Dorn. The phrase, "future return of authorized personnel," had landed heavily on all three of them at once. "Are humans still alive?" Threk asked, before he could stop himself. Another pause, this one longer than the last. That information is classified pending assessment completion, the voice said. Please stand by. The transmission ended there, cutting off cleanly, leaving the bridge of the long reach in a silence far heavier than before. The assessment, as it turned out, did not simply happen in the background while they waited. Over the following hours, a series of questions came through the comm system, delivered in that same calm, even voice, covering an enormous range of subjects. Some of the questions were simple. Where had they found the star charts that led them here? How many vessels did the Kethran people possess? What was their intended use for any salvage they might collect? Others were far stranger, and far more searching. What was the Kethran approach to conflict resolution between differing peoples? How did Kethran law treat the property of the deceased? What value did Kethran culture place on preserving the history of others? Threk answered every question as honestly as he could, though it left him uneasy in a way he couldn't quite name, the sense of being examined by something far older and far more patient than himself. It's not just checking whether we're dangerous, Sela observed, after one particularly long exchange about how the Kethran assembly handled disputes between rival trading houses. It's trying to understand what kind of people we are, whether we can be trusted with something. I don't know what. With this, Dorn said, gesturing at the wider view outside the ship, at the thousands of silent warships still hanging in their neat formation. Maybe with all of it. Threk thought about that for a long time. A fleet this size, kept in perfect readiness, guarded by a system old enough and clever enough to hold real conversations after centuries of silence, waiting for something. Waiting, apparently, for someone worthy of trust. What happens to the fleet if it decides we're not trustworthy? Threk asked, the next time the voice returned with another question. If assessment concludes hostile or exploitative intent, the voice answered, without hesitation. Active defense measures will be deployed to prevent access to fleet assets. All vessels within the assessment radius will be treated as potential threats. And if it concludes we're trustworthy, then appropriate accommodations will be made, within the limits of my authorization. What accommodations? That information is classified pending assessment completion. Threk sat back in his chair, rubbing at his forehead with two of his four hands, a very old Kethran gesture of frustration that Sela had picked up on years ago, as a sign her captain badly needed rest he wasn't going to take. This thing has been running for who knows how long, Threk said quietly, mostly to himself. Alone, watching this fleet, waiting for someone to show up, and now that someone finally has, it's not sure what to do with us either. Do you think it's telling the truth? Sela asked, about the assessment, about giving us a fair chance? I think, Threk said slowly, that whatever built this system built it to be patient, and thorough, and very hard to fool. I think our best chance is to actually be what we're claiming to be. Honest, careful, not greedy. Even with 6,000 warships sitting right there, Dorn said, worth more than anything we've ever found in our lives. Especially with 6,000 warships sitting right there, Threk said. Because I have a feeling that if we try to take even one of them by force, or by trickery, this system is going to notice, and I do not want to find out what happens after that. They settled in to wait, the assessment continuing in slow, careful stages over the following day, question after question, the crew of the long reach, doing their best to answer honestly, and hoping it would be enough. But even as the conversation continued, Threk found himself watching the sensor readouts more and more closely, unable to shake a growing unease. Because far out at the edge of their scanning range, past the edge of the massive fleet formation, other contacts had begun to appear, small ships at first, then larger ones, drawn in by the same old star charts, or perhaps by faint traces of the long reach. Zone transmissions, leaking out into the void where other eyes might catch them. The Kethran assembly was not the only species with salvagers hungry for a find like this one, and not every ship arriving in this system was going to be as careful, or as patient, as Threk had decided to be. The fleet's assessment might have started with the long reach. But it was not going to end there, and somewhere deep inside the massive central ship at the heart of the formation, systems that had slept for centuries continued, slowly and steadily, to come back online, one by one, as more and more strangers arrived at the edge of a graveyard that was never meant to stay quiet forever. That night, if night meant anything out in the middle of empty space, Threk could not sleep. He lay in his small bunk, listening to the familiar hum of the long reach WES systems, and found his mind circling back again and again to the calm, patient voice that had spoken to them from a ship built by people who no longer, as far as anyone knew, existed. He thought about the word assessment, and what it might mean to be judged by something old enough to have watched empires rise and fall while it waited alone in the dark. He got up eventually, unable to lie still any longer, and made his way to the small galley at the center of the ship, where he found Sella already sitting at the table, a cup of something warm cradled in her hands, staring at nothing in particular. "Couldn't sleep either," she said, not really a question. "No." Threk pulled out the seat across from her and sat down heavily. "Keep thinking about what happens if we fail this assessment of theirs. You think it would actually attack us? After everything it's said so far?" "I don't know," Threk admitted. "That's the problem. We've spent our whole lives salvaging from species that no longer had any say in what happened to their things. Dead cities, empty stations, nobody home to ask permission from, nobody to disappoint. This is different. This is someone still watching, still caring what we do." Sella turned her cup slowly between her hands. "Does that scare you?" "A little," Threk admitted. "Mostly it makes me want to be careful, really careful. Because I don't think we get to be careless with this one and walk away clean." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, the kind of quiet that came easily after years of working side by side, before Sella spoke again. "Can I ask you something, Captain?" "Go ahead. If this all works out, if the assessment clears us, and we're allowed to salvage, or trade, or whatever comes next, do you actually want that? Or is some part of you just as curious as I am about what's really out here? Assessment or no assessment?" Threk considered the question honestly before answering. "Both, I think. I came here chasing a payday, same as always. But somewhere in the last few days, that stopped being the only thing I care about. I want to know what happened to them, why they left. Whether there's really anyone left to come home to a fleet like this one." "Careful, Captain," Sella said, a small tired smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "You're starting to sound like someone with a conscience." "Don't tell Dorn," Threk said. "He'll never let me hear the end of it." They both managed a small laugh at that, quiet and worn but real, the first real laugh either of them had shared since arriving in the system days before. It didn't fix anything. It didn't answer any of the questions hanging over their heads, but it made the waiting, at least for a little while, feel a bit more bearable. The first new ship arrived on the third day of the assessment, a battered mining vessel flying the colors of the Grethic Consortium, a species Threk knew mostly by reputation, and not a good one. The Grethic were traders too, in their own way, but their idea of trading often skipped the part where both sides agreed to the terms. They were not violent by nature, but they were opportunistic to a fault, the kind of people who saw an unguarded warehouse and thought of it as an invitation rather than a crime scene. Threk watched the newcomer's sensor signature crawl across his screen, with a growing sense of dread. "They're heading straight for the fleet," Sella reported. "No hesitation, no caution, like they already know exactly what's out there." "They probably picked up our transmissions," Dorn said, "or found their own copy of those old star charts. Word travels fast when someone finds something this big." Threk opened a channel to the Soul Guardian network, the calm voice that had been quietly interrogating them for the better part of 2 days now. "You're aware of the new arrival," Threk said. It wasn't really a question. "Affirmative," the voice replied. "Assessment protocols have been initiated for the new vessel." "They don't seem like the patient type," Threk said. "I'd guess they're planning to start salvage immediately, without waiting for anyone's permission." "That assessment aligns with preliminary data," the voice said. "Monitoring in progress." Threk watched, tense, as the Grethic ship closed the distance to the outer edge of the fleet formation, slowing only slightly as it approached one of the smaller vessels near the perimeter. A cargo boom extended from the mining ship's hull, reaching out toward the derelict warship's exterior, clearly intending to start cutting into the hull plating without so much as a greeting. "They're not even trying to talk to it," Sella said, disbelief in her voice. "They're just going straight for salvage." "Warning issued," the Soul Guardian network reported, its voice as calm as ever. though Threk thought he detected something colder underneath the words this time. Vessel has been instructed to cease unauthorized contact with fleet assets and depart the assessment radius. On the screen, the Grethic ship did not slow down. If anything, the cargo boom extended further, and a bright flare of cutting equipment ignited at its tip, aimed directly at the hull of the nearest warship. Second warning issued, the voice said. Non-compliance detected. The cutting beam touched the warship's hull. Sparks flew, a shower of bright orange light against the black of space, as the beam began to bite into centuries-old armor plating. The response was immediate, and it was nothing like the slow, patient assessment Threk and his crew had been experiencing for the past 2 days. The warship the Grethic vessel had been cutting into came alive in an instant, its hull lights blazing on all at once, followed a heartbeat later by a full weapons discharge that lit up the darkness like a small sun. The mining ship's cargo boom and the section of hull it had been attached to simply ceased to exist, vaporized in a blast of energy that Threk's own sensors struggled to fully register before it was already over. The Grethic ship, what was left of it, tumbled away from the fleet formation, trailing atmosphere and debris, its engines dead, its hull scorched black along one entire side. "Oh no," Sella breathed. "Wait," Threk said quickly, watching the readouts. "It's still intact." "Mostly. They didn't destroy it. Look at the targeting pattern. The damage is all concentrated on the boom and the cutting equipment. That was a warning shot, not a killing blow." The voice of the Soul Guardian network confirmed it a moment later, still perfectly calm despite what had just happened. "Hostile vessel has been disabled and is no longer capable of unauthorized salvage activity. No fatalities detected among crew. Vessel will be permitted to depart the system once minimal repairs are completed." "You could have destroyed them completely," Threk said, unable to keep the shock out of his own voice. "Destruction of the vessel was not required to achieve the objective," the voice replied. "The objective was prevention of unauthorized salvage, not elimination of the crew. Excessive force is not an efficient use of fleet resources." Threk sat back in his chair, processing what he had just seen. A fleet that had sat perfectly still and silent for days, while 3 of them wandered around inside one of its ships, asking careful questions and being patient, had just come alive in less than a second, the moment someone tried to simply take what they wanted by force. And it had done so with terrifying surgical precision, disabling a threat without killing anyone. The kind of restraint that took either enormous skill or enormous self-control, and possibly both. "That could have been us," Sella said quietly, "if we'd tried to take something instead of asking permission." "I think," Threk said slowly, "that's exactly the point it's trying to make." Word of what happened to the Grethic mining ship spread fast, faster than Threk would have liked, carried by the ship's own limping distress calls as it retreated from the system, broadcasting a warning to anyone listening about the armed and active fleet, guarding what should have been easy salvage. Threk hoped, briefly, that the warning would scare off any other opportunists before they arrived. He was wrong. If anything, the news seemed to draw more attention, not less. A fleet of thousands of warships, ancient but clearly still armed and dangerous, sitting untouched around a legendary lost world, was simply too big a prize for some people to resist, warning or no warning. Over the following 2 days, 3 more ships arrived in the system, a pair of Ostrek raiders, quick and heavily armed vessels known for hitting weak targets and running before anyone could organize a proper response, and a much larger ship belonging to a trading consortium Threk didn't recognize at all, its hull marked with symbols from a species he had never encountered before. Each new arrival went through the same process. The Soul Guardian network reached out, offered a calm and clear warning, explained the assessment protocol, and gave every newcomer the chance to cooperate. The unfamiliar trading consortium's ship, cautious by nature or perhaps simply smarter than the others, agreed to the terms immediately, backing off to a respectful distance and beginning its own version of the same patient conversation Threk had been having for days. The Ostrek raiders did not. Threk watched from the long reach bridge as the 2 raider ships split apart, one heading for the outer edge of the formation, while the other looped wide, clearly intending to hit 2 different targets at once, spreading the fleet's response thin. It didn't work. Whatever the Soul Guardian network actually was, however it worked, it was not a single mind trying to track multiple threats with limited attention. The moment both raider ships crossed whatever invisible line counted as hostile action, the response came from multiple directions at once. Ships all across the formation lighting up in eerie unison, weapons tracking with a precision that made Threk's stomach turn. The first raider ship took a hit across its engine section and went dark immediately, drifting dead in space. The second, faster or luckier, managed to break away before the same fate found it, its pilot apparently realizing at the last possible second exactly how badly outmatched they were, and fled the system at maximum burn, leaving its disabled partner behind. "They're not even trying to hide how strong they are," Dorn said, watching the whole exchange with a kind of horrified fascination. "They could probably have destroyed both of those ships in half a second if they wanted to. Instead, they're pulling their punches every single time, disabling instead of killing, giving warnings before they act. That's not a system running on pure aggression. That's something making very deliberate choices." "It's not just defending the fleet," Sela said slowly, working through the thought as she spoke it. "It's teaching a lesson. To anyone watching. Come here with bad intentions, and you'll get exactly enough force to stop you, and not one bit more. It wants word to spread. It wants people to know the rules before they decide whether to break them." Threk found himself agreeing with her, but the thought that followed close behind was far less comforting. A system with that much restraint, that much control, watching over a fleet of 6,000 warships for who knew how many centuries, waiting patiently for the right people to come along, was not a system Threk wanted to accidentally disappoint. Because restraint, he understood now, was a choice, and choices could change. On the fifth day, the Soul Guardian network finally reached out to the Long Reach. Directly, and this time the tone of the conversation was different, less like an interrogation, more like the beginning of something else. "Captain Dasson," the voice said, "preliminary assessment of your crew and your intentions has been completed. Your conduct throughout this process has been noted favorably. You have demonstrated patience, honesty, and restraint, even in the presence of significant potential gain." Threk felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't realized was wound so tight. "Does that mean we're free to go? Or free to salvage?" "It means your threat classification has been downgraded to minimal," the voice said. "However, full authorization for salvage, or extended contact, requires a decision beyond my current parameters. I am not authorized to grant access to certain fleet assets, certain classified data, or certain locations, without confirmation from a higher authority." "A higher authority?" Threk repeated. "You mean humans. There are still humans somewhere." There was a pause, longer than usual, and Threk had the strange, distinct impression that the system on the other end of the connection was choosing its next words with unusual care. "I am permitted to confirm the following," the voice said finally. The Sol Guardian network was not designed to operate indefinitely without oversight. It was designed to maintain this fleet, protect this system, and manage encounters with outside parties until such time as a return could be organized. That time has not yet come, but it is closer than it has been in a very long while. Sela leaned forward. "Closer how? What does that mean?" "It means," the voice said, "that your arrival, and the arrival of others like you, has triggered a series of protocols that have not activated in a significant period of time. Reports of this system's rediscovery are being transmitted, through channels I am not required to disclose, to parties who have been waiting a long time to receive them." Threk exchanged a look with Sela and Dorn, the same unspoken question passing between all three of them at once. "You're calling them home," Threk said slowly. "Aren't you, whoever's left, wherever they are? You're telling them Earth's been found." The voice did not confirm it directly, but it also did not deny it. "I am authorized to inform you," it said instead, "that additional vessels will be entering this system within the coming days. Their intentions toward the fleet, toward Earth, and toward any parties currently present are not fully known to me, and are not mine to predict. I would advise all vessels currently within this system to conduct themselves with continued caution." Threk sat back slowly, staring out at the vast, silent fleet still hanging in its careful formation. Thousands of warships that had woken from their long sleep just enough to defend themselves, just enough to test the intentions of everyone who came looking. And somewhere out there, in the dark beyond the edge of his sensors, something else was already on its way. something that had been waiting far longer than Threk had, for a chance to come home. "How many more ships?" Threk asked quietly. "Are we talking about?" The Soul Guardian Network's answer, when it came, carried the first hint of something that almost sounded, to Threk's ears, like anticipation. "That information," it said, "is no longer classified. It is simply unknown, even to me. It has been a very long time since anyone counted them." News of the disabled Ostrek raider spread through the small, growing collection of ships in the system almost as fast as the news about the Grethic miner had, and the effect was immediate. Where before there had been a scattering of cautious, distant vessels watching from the edges, now something closer to a loose, uneasy community began to form, ships hailing one another across the open channels, trading rumors, comparing notes on what they had each learned from their own conversations with the Guardian system. Threk found himself talking more than once with the captain of the unfamiliar trading consortium ship, a tall, quiet being named Voss Carnet, who represented a species called the Ashen Concord, traders from a cluster of systems far beyond anything Threk's own people had ever charted. Voss was cautious by nature, careful with his words, but curious in a way that reminded Threk uncomfortably of himself. "You've been here longer than any of us," Voss said, during one of their exchanges, his voice carrying the low, rolling cadence typical of his species. "What is your read on it? On the system, and on them?" "Honestly," Threk said, "I think we found something a lot bigger than any of us expected, and I think whatever's guarding it is smarter and more patient than anything I've ever dealt with before." "Patient," Voss repeated, turning the word over as though tasting it. "That is not the word I expected to hear used about a warship." "It's the only word that fits," Threk said. "It could have destroyed every ship that's come through here so far in an instant. It hasn't. It keeps giving people chances they probably don't deserve. That's not just good programming. That's a choice, made over and over again, by something that could just as easily choose differently." Voss was quiet for a long moment. "My people have a saying. A blade that never strikes is not mercy. It is simply waiting for the right moment. I wonder which this is." Threk thought about that long after the conversation ended, turning it over in his mind the way he imagined Voss had turned over his own words. It was a fair question, and an uncomfortable one, and Threk did not have a good answer for it. All he had was a growing conviction, built slowly over days of careful observation, that whatever was watching over this system was not simply waiting for an excuse to strike. It was waiting for something else entirely. Something Threk was beginning to suspect none of them, himself included, fully understood yet. He found himself thinking, too, about the fragments of the old human language Dorn had been slowly piecing together, the handful of records and half-translated messages recovered from the Defiant dormant archives during their brief, careful visits back to the ship over the following days, always under Sentinel's watchful supervision now, always with explicit permission granted first. Most of what they found was mundane. Maintenance logs, supply manifests, the ordinary paperwork of a fleet preparing for something. But scattered among the mundane records were other things, personal messages, left behind by crew members who had once served aboard these ships, messages that had never been sent, addressed to people who were, by now, almost certainly long gone. Dorn read one of them aloud to Threk and Sella one evening, his voice quieter than usual as he worked through the rough translation. "If anyone ever finds this," he read, "and we are not here to greet you, know that we did not leave lightly. We left so that something of us would still be here to come back to, if the day ever comes. Take care of her for us. She deserves better than to sit empty forever." Nobody spoke for a while after that. Threk looked out at the dark shape of Earth, hanging quiet and untouched in the distance, and understood, for the first time, exactly what kind of promise this fleet had been built to keep. The days that followed brought more ships into the system, some cautious, some greedy, most of them turning cautious very quickly once word spread of what had happened to the ones who tried to take without asking. The Soul Guardian Network handled each new arrival with the same calm, patient process it had used on the Long Reach, offering warnings, granting time, disabling anyone foolish enough to ignore both. By the end of the first week, a strange kind of order had settled over the system. A loose gathering of alien ships hung at a respectful distance from the fleet, watching, waiting, trading rumors and half-understood information back and forth across open channels, while the Guardian system continued its long, slow assessment of everyone present. Threk had expected, after his own assessment cleared, that the Long Reach would be allowed to begin some kind of limited, supervised salvage. Instead, the days kept passing, with no such permission granted, only the same repeated message: full authorization, required confirmation from a higher authority that had not yet arrived. He was beginning to wonder if that authority would ever come at all, when the sensors picked up the first sign that something was finally changing. It started as a single contact at the very edge of the system's detection range, small and fast, moving with a precision and confidence that immediately set it apart from every other ship that had arrived so far. It did not hesitate at the system's edge the way the others had. It did not slow to assess the situation. It came in on a direct course, straight for the heart of the fleet, moving with the kind of certainty that only came from someone who already knew exactly where they were going, and exactly what they would find when they got there. "Captain," Sella said, watching the new contacts approach with narrowed eyes, "that ship's profile doesn't match anything in our database. Not the Grethic, not the Ostrek, not the consortium ship. It's not matching any known configuration at all." "Could it be human?" Dorn asked, and there was something in his voice, half excitement and half nerves, that mirrored exactly what Threk was feeling himself. They didn't have to wait long for an answer. As the new ship drew close enough for detailed scans, its shape resolved on the main screen, sleek, fast, built along lines that echoed the ancient warships of the fleet, but with a leaner, more modern profile. Clearly the product of technology that had continued advancing long after the fleet itself had been mothballed. Its hull carried the same sharp, angular writing they had seen on the Defiant. Though newer, cleaner, more recently painted. The ship slowed as it approached the edge of the fleet formation, and a transmission came through, this time not from the calm, synthetic voice of the Soul Guardian network, but from something new entirely. A voice that carried warmth, and weariness, and an edge of something that sounded almost like grief. "This is Commander Alice Reyes, of the Sol Remnant vessel. Second Dawn. To all ships currently within this system, I am addressing the Fleet Reserve's Guardian system directly. Sentinel, report status." The Soul Guardian network's familiar voice answered immediately, and Threk thought he detected, for the first time since he had begun speaking with it, something that might have been relief. "Commander Reyes. Confirmed identity match. Status report. Fleet Reserve intact. 98% operational readiness, maintained across all standby systems. 17 unauthorized contact incidents, logged since system rediscovery. 0 fatalities resulting from defensive actions. Current foreign presence in system, 11 vessels, representing 6 distinct species, undergoing individual threat assessment. Copy that, Sentinel. Good work. It's been a long watch." "It has, Commander. Welcome home." The words hit Threk harder than he expected, even though he had no personal stake in them, even though he had never met a human before in his life, and had spent most of his career assuming they were nothing more than a story. There was something in the exchange, something in the simple, tired warmth of that reunion, between a lonely machine and the person it had been waiting to see for who knew how many years, that made the whole bridge of the Long Reach. "Go quiet. Commander Reyes," Threk finally said, opening a channel of his own. "This is Captain Threk Dasson of the Long Reach. We arrived in this system 9 days ago and have been cooperating fully with the assessment process. I would very much like to speak with you, if you're willing." There was a pause before the response came, and when it did, the warmth was still there, but underneath it, Threk could hear something sharper, more careful. "Captain Dasson, Sentinel has already briefed me on your conduct. I understand you've been more patient than most. I appreciate that. But I hope you'll understand if I'm not ready to simply hand out invitations yet. There's a lot to sort out, and not much time to do it in." "Not much time?" Sella repeated, catching the phrase immediately. "Commander, is something wrong?" Another pause, longer this time. "You could say that," Reyes said. "You're not the only ones who found those old star charts, Captain. And not everyone who's coming is as patient as you've been." Over the following hour, more information began to trickle out. Some of it from Commander Reyes directly, some of it pieced together by Dorn from fragments of encrypted chatter. The second dawn wasn't quite careful enough to fully hide. The picture that emerged left Threk with a knot in his stomach that hadn't been there before. Humanity had not vanished from the galaxy the way the old stories claimed. They had withdrawn, deliberately, centuries ago, retreating from Earth and this system to a hidden network of colonies scattered far from the well-traveled trade routes, driven out by a threat none of the old stories had ever accurately described. Not a war between equals, not a plague or a curse or some slow decline. Something far worse. A hostile, expansionist power called, in the fragments Dorn managed to translate, simply, the Harvest. A species or coalition that had targeted Earth and its colonies specifically, drawn by humanity's rapid technological growth and eager to claim it for themselves by any means necessary. Humanity had not lost that war outright, but they had not won it cleanly either. Faced with an enemy too large to defeat and too persistent to outlast, the leadership of the time had made a brutal choice: abandon Earth, scatter the surviving population into hiding, and leave behind the reserve fleet, dormant and guarded, both as a decoy to draw attention away from the real hidden colonies, and as a resource to reclaim once humanity was strong enough to need it again. The star charts weren't a leak, Reyes explained, once she had decided Threk and his crew had earned at least that much of an explanation. They were bait, old, deliberately old, seeded out into the wider galaxy over the decades by agents most people never even knew were human, meant to lead exactly the kind of curious, patient people you've turned out to be straight to this system. Sentinel's job was never really about protecting salvage from thieves. It was about testing whoever came looking, learning who could be trusted, before we ever had to reveal ourselves at all. And the ones who weren't patient? Threk asked. The ones who fired first, or tried to take without asking? Get disabled, and sent home with a very clear message, Reyes said, and a very clear warning for the next people who might come looking. It's not perfect. But it's kept the worst actors at arm's length for a long time. Until now, Sella said quietly. Until now, Reyes agreed. Because the charts didn't just reach salvagers looking for a payday, Captain Dassin. They reached the Harvest too. And unlike everyone else who's shown up in this system so far, the Harvest isn't interested in salvage. They're interested in finishing what they started. The knot in Threk's stomach tightened further. How long do we have? Sentinel first detected their approach 3 days ago, Reyes said. Best estimate, based on their fleet's typical cruising speed, is that they'll reach this system within the next 2 days. Maybe less. 2 days, Dorn repeated, disbelief written across his face. And you're bringing one ship? I'm bringing the first ship, Reyes corrected. The second dawn isn't here to fight the Harvest alone, Engineer Cade. I'm here to confirm Sentinel's assessment data, coordinate with the reserve fleet's activation protocols, and buy enough time for the rest of the Sol Remnant fleet to arrive. Which is where I'm afraid I have to ask something difficult of everyone currently sitting in this system. Threk felt the shape of the request before Reyes even said it, a cold certainty settling over him. You want us to stay, he said, and help defend a fleet that isn't even ours, against an enemy we've never even heard of before today. I want to ask, Reyes said carefully, not order. Nobody in this system owes humanity anything, least of all a fight that was never theirs to begin with. Any ship that wants to leave now, before the Harvest arrives, has my word that Sentinel will let you go without interference, and my thanks for your patience up to this point. But I won't pretend the offer isn't there, for anyone willing to stand with us. Because the truth is, Captain, we could use every gun we can get. The next several hours were some of the tensest Threk had ever lived through, filled with hurried, half-panicked communication between every ship currently sitting in the system, as word of the approaching threat spread from vessel to vessel. 2 of the smaller salvage crews decided immediately to cut their losses and flee, disappearing into jump points within the hour, unwilling to risk their lives for a fight that wasn't theirs. Threk didn't blame them. Part of him wanted to do the same thing, point the long reach toward the nearest jump point and never look back at this system again. But another part of him, a part he hadn't fully expected to find inside himself, kept circling back to the image of that lonely patient system, Sentinel, waiting alone in the dark for centuries, testing stranger after stranger with careful restraint, instead of blind violence, hoping against the odds that someone worth trusting would eventually come along. And to the sound of Commander Reyes's voice, tired and worn, but still standing between an entire fleet's worth of history and an enemy that wanted to erase it completely. "What are you thinking, Captain?" Sella asked quietly, watching him from across the bridge. Threk looked out at the vast, silent shape of the fleet, thousands of ships that had slept for so long, finally beginning to wake, and thought about all the stories he had grown up hearing about Earth and its vanished people. Stories he had never quite believed, and now knew, firsthand, were only half true. "I'm thinking," he said slowly, "that we came here looking for salvage, and instead we found something worth a lot more than that." Dorn frowned. "Captain, the Long Reach has exactly 2 cannons bolted to the hull, and neither of them were ever meant to fight anything bigger than a pirate skiff. If this harvest fleet is even half as dangerous as Commander Reyes makes them sound, we won't last 5 minutes in a real fight." "I know," Threk said. "I'm not planning to fly the Long Reach into the middle of a battle line, Dorn, but there are other ways to be useful. Sentinel's fleet has thousands of ships, and from what Reyes has said, not enough crew to run more than a fraction of them. Not yet, not on this short notice. If we can help even a little, moving supplies, relaying data, pulling wounded out of danger, whatever's needed, then that's worth doing." Sella studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "For what it's worth, Captain, I agree. I didn't expect to feel this way about a bunch of strangers we met 9 days ago. But I do." Dorn sighed, the sound of a man who already knew he'd lost the argument before it had properly started. "All right. For the record, I still think this is a terrible idea. But I'm not letting the 2 of you fly into a war zone without me either." Threk opened a channel back to the second dawn, and a sentinel listening quietly alongside it, and gave the answer he already knew. Deep down, he had decided the moment Commander Reyes first asked. "The Long Reach is staying," he said. "Whatever you need from us, Commander, you've got it." There was a brief pause, and then Reyes's voice returned, quieter than before, carrying something that sounded almost like surprise, and underneath that, something that sounded very much like gratitude. "Thank you, Captain Dassin," she said. "I hope, someday, we get the chance to properly repay that kindness." Out beyond the viewport, across the vast dark expanse of the system, the fleet continued waking, ship after ship after ship, engines flickering to life, for the first time in centuries, weapon systems cycling through long-dormant checks, thousands of dark hulls slowly beginning to glow with the pale light of active power. And somewhere out past the edge of Threk's sensors, closing in with every passing hour, an old enemy was returning too, unaware that the world it had once driven into hiding was no longer quite so undefended as it used to be. Commander Reyes came aboard the Long Reach. Briefly that evening, a short visit meant to coordinate logistics, though Threk suspected she also simply needed a few minutes away from the second dawn. His cramped command deck and the endless stream of decisions waiting for her there. She looked older up close than her voice had suggested over the comm, tired in a way that went deeper than lack of sleep. "You didn't have to come all the way over here yourself," Threk said, guiding her to a seat in the small galley. "A message would have done." "Maybe," Reyes said, "but I wanted to see the faces of the people who agreed to stay. Feels important somehow, before all this starts." Sella brought her something warm to drink, and for a few minutes, the 3 of them simply sat together, not talking about the harvest, or the battle to come, or any of the heavy things pressing down on all of them. Reyes asked about the Kethrin Assembly instead, about Threk's people, their worlds, their history, and Threk found himself talking more freely than he expected, telling her about the long, difficult centuries his own species had spent clawing their way up from a single overcrowded homeworld to a modest scattering of colonies, never quite as strong or as celebrated as some of the older species they traded with, but stubborn, and patient, and good at finding value where others saw nothing. "Sounds familiar," Reyes said with a tired smile. "Humanity was never the strongest, or the fastest, or the smartest species out there either. We were just too stubborn to know when to quit. Still are, apparently." "Seems to be working out for you," Threk said. "So far." "Ask me again in 2 days," Reyes said, but there was a warmth in her voice now that hadn't been there when she first arrived. Before she left, she paused at the airlock, looking back at Threk with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Whatever happens out there," she said, "I want you to know this mattered. Not just the fighting, if it comes to that. The fact that you stayed to help even before you knew what was coming. That kind of thing doesn't happen by accident, Captain. It happens because of who you decide to be, every single day, long before anyone's watching to see if you'll live up to it." She left after that, her shuttle peeling away toward the second dawn. And Threk stood at the viewport for a long time afterward, watching the great dark shape of the fleet slowly filling with light, thinking about her words, and about the long, strange road that had brought a salvager, chasing old rumors, all the way to the edge of somebody else's war. The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation. Commander Reyes, working closely with Sentinel, began the slow process of bringing the reserve fleet fully online, ship by ship, system by system, a task that would normally have required thousands of trained crew members, and instead had to be managed by a combination of automated systems, a skeleton crew aboard the Second Dawn, and whatever help the handful of remaining alien ships in the system were willing to offer. Threk found himself surprised by how many of the other captains chose to stay. The unfamiliar trading consortium ship, once its own crew learned the full truth of what was coming, offered its considerable cargo capacity to help ferry emergency supplies between vessels. Even one of the Ostrek raiders that had tried to hit the fleet days earlier returned, its captain offering an awkward, half-embarrassed apology, alongside an offer to help however they could, an offer Reyes accepted without hesitation or grudge, a choice that told Threk more about the kind of leader she was than anything she could have said in words. "We don't have time to hold grudges," Reyes told him when he asked about it privately. "Not against people who are willing to stand and fight when it actually matters. Sentinel's already done the hard work of figuring out who can be trusted. My job now is just to use that trust as well as I can." The Long Reach spent those 2 days doing exactly what Threk had promised, ferrying supplies, relaying data between ships that didn't share a common communication protocol, and helping Sentinel coordinate the slow, careful process of bringing enough of the ancient fleet online to matter. It was not glamorous work. It was not the kind of thing songs got written about. But by the time the Harvest fleet's approach finally registered on long-range sensors, late on the second day, Threk found a strange, quiet pride in what they had managed to accomplish anyway. "Contact," Sella reported, her voice tight. "Multiple contacts. A lot of them." The numbers scrolled across the screen, climbing steadily, as Sentinel's own sensors, far more powerful than anything aboard the Long Reach, filled in the details. The Harvest fleet was smaller than Sol's reserve, in raw numbers, somewhere around 800 vessels compared to the reserve's thousands, but the ships themselves were larger, individually, than most of the reserve fleet's rank and file, built along heavy, brutal lines clearly designed for one purpose: overwhelming force. "They're not here to negotiate," Dorn said quietly, studying the approaching formation. "Look at that arrangement. That's an attack formation. Straight in, no hesitation." Commander Reyes's voice came through a moment later, calm despite the pressure Threk knew she had to be feeling. "All ships, this is the Second Dawn. Sentinel has authorization to bring the full reserve fleet online. I want every allied vessel pulled back behind the defensive line Sentinel is marking on your tactical displays. This is going to get ugly fast, and I don't want anyone caught in the crossfire who doesn't need to be." "Copy that, Commander," Threk replied, already guiding the Long Reach toward the marked position, a safe distance behind the massed ranks of the ancient warships, now glowing with active power all across the system. "For what it's worth, good luck out there." "Same to you, Captain. Stay safe." What followed was unlike anything Threk had ever witnessed in his life, and he suspected it was unlike anything most beings currently alive in the galaxy had ever witnessed either. Thousands of ships that had slept in perfect silence for centuries surged forward as one, moving with a coordination that made Threk's earlier awe at Sentinel's precision look small by comparison. The Harvest fleet, for all its size and brutal strength, had clearly expected an easier fight, a scattered, disorganized defense they could crush through sheer aggression. What they found instead was a wall of firepower that moved and reacted like a single living thing. The battle that followed was fast, and terrible, and beautiful in the strange way that only truly overwhelming displays of power could be. Weapon fire lit up the darkness in long streaks of light, ships on both sides taking hits, some crumbling into wreckage, others limping away trailing atmosphere and fire. Threk watched from the long reach. Relative safety, helping relay damage reports and coordinate supply runs to wherever they were needed most, his heart in his throat the entire time. It was not a clean victory. Sentinel's fleet, for all its size and readiness, had been asleep for centuries, and some of its ships struggled with systems that hadn't been properly tested in generations, engines failing at critical moments, weapons misfiring, a handful of vessels lost not to enemy fire, but simply to the wear of time finally catching up all at once. But the Harvest fleet, confident and aggressive, had walked into a fight they badly underestimated, and as the hours dragged on, that miscalculation began to cost them dearly. "Sentinel," Reyes called out, midway through the fighting, her voice sharp with urgency. "I need the reserve to concentrate fire on their command vessel, that big one at the center of their formation. If we can take that out, the rest might break." "Acknowledged, Commander. Redirecting available fleet assets." Threk watched on his screen as dozens of the ancient warships shifted course at once, converging on the massive Harvest command vessel with a coordinated fury that seemed almost personal, as if some fraction of Sentinel's long centuries of patient, careful restraint had finally found an outlet worth unleashing completely. The command vessel fought back hard, its own defenses tearing into the approaching warships, claiming several of them even as it began to buckle under the concentrated assault. And then, in a single bright flash that lit up the entire system for a fraction of a second, the Harvest command vessel broke apart entirely, and the rest of the Harvest fleet, exactly as Reyes had predicted, began to falter. It wasn't an instant surrender. The remaining Harvest ships fought a desperate, scattered retreat over the following hour, trying to salvage what they could of their attack before the reserve fleet could finish the job entirely. But the tide had turned, unmistakably, and by the time the last Harvest vessels finally broke off and fled toward the nearest jump point, the system belonged, once again, to humanity and its allies. In the aftermath, the long reach found itself with more work than ever, ferrying medical supplies to damaged ships, helping coordinate search efforts for stranded crew members drifting in the wreckage of the battle, the exhausting, unglamorous labor that always followed any fight, no matter how it ended. Threk barely had time to process what had happened until nearly a full day later, when Commander Reyes finally called him aboard the Second Dawn. Directly, the first time they had met face-to-face rather than through a comm channel, Reyes turned out to be shorter than Threk had pictured, with tired eyes and a firm handshake, the kind of person who looked like she hadn't slept properly in longer than she'd admit to. She led him through the Second Dawn. These cramped corridors to a small observation deck overlooking the battered but still standing reserve fleet. Thousands of ships that had, against all odds, held the line. "We lost a lot of good ships today," Reyes said quietly, looking out at the wreckage still drifting among the formation. "Some of them had been sitting in that formation since before either of us were born, Captain. It's strange, mourning something that's been sitting quiet and empty for centuries, but we do it anyway." "For what it's worth," Threk said, "I don't think anyone watching today would call that fleet empty. Not really. Not after what it just did." Reyes gave him a small, tired smile. "No, I suppose not." She was quiet for a moment, watching the slow drift of the fleet, before she spoke again. "I owe you and your crew a great deal, Captain Dassin. More than I think you realize. You didn't have to stay. Most people in your position wouldn't have. Sentinel gave us a fair chance, when it could have just as easily assumed the worst," Threk said. "Seemed only right to return the favor when it mattered." "Well," Reyes said, "the Sol Remnant doesn't forget a debt like that. I've already sent word back to our main colonies about what happened here, about the ships that chose to stand and fight when they didn't have to. There's going to be a lot of rebuilding ahead of us, now that Earth's location is compromised, and hiding isn't really an option anymore. We're going to need trading partners. Allies, people who've already proven they can be trusted." Threk felt something shift in his chest, a door opening, that he hadn't expected to see opened at all, when he first followed those old star charts into this system, chasing nothing more than the promise of a good salvage haul. "Are you saying humanity is coming back?" he asked. "For real this time. Not just a reserve fleet and a lonely guardian system, but actually coming back." Reyes looked out at Earth, visible as a small blue point of light in the distance beyond the fleet, quiet and untouched, despite everything that had just happened around it. "I think," she said slowly, "that we've been hiding long enough. The harvest knows where we are now. One way or another. Hiding was never going to work forever. Might as well come home properly, and bring some good history with us, instead of just grief and old ghosts." Sentinels watched over this place a very long time, waiting for the right moment. "I think this might finally be it." Threk found himself smiling, an expression that felt strange and new after the tension of the past several days. "Well, Commander, if you're looking for a first trading partner willing to vouch for you, the Kethran Assembly could do a lot worse than a species that builds fleets like this one, and Guardians patient enough to wait centuries for the right people to show up." "I'll hold you to that, Captain," Reyes said, extending her hand again, and this time, Threk shook it with a genuine warmth he hadn't expected to feel, toward a species he had, only a couple of weeks ago, assumed was nothing more than an old story. The Long Reach left the system 3 weeks later, its cargo hold empty of salvage, exactly the opposite of what Threk had originally set out to find, but sitting in its place, in a small secured drive tucked safely into the ship's data core, was something Threk considered far more valuable. The first formal trade and defense agreement between the newly reawakened Sol Remnant and the Kethran Assembly, a document that Reyes had personally helped draft, and that Threk had the honor of being the very first outsider to carry beyond the system's borders. Behind him, as the Long Reach pulled away and lined up for its jump point, the reserve fleet continued its slow, steady work of repair and renewal. Thousands of ancient warships settling into a new kind of purpose after centuries of patient, silent waiting. Sentinel's calm voice still watched over all of it, no longer alone, no longer simply testing strangers for signs of hostile intent, but coordinating instead, with a crew that was steadily, finally, growing larger by the day, as word spread, and more humans, drawn from hidden colonies scattered across the galaxy, began making their way home. Threk thought about the old stories he had grown up hearing, the ones about a violent, clever species that had built machines beyond understanding, and then simply vanished, and found himself smiling at how wrong, and how right, they had turned out to be all at once. Humans had not vanished. They had waited, patiently, painfully, for the right moment to return, guarded the whole time by a fleet and a guardian system, built with exactly the kind of careful restraint and quiet strength that Threk had come to respect more than he ever expected to when he first followed a dying trader's old star charts into an empty, silent system. As the Long Reach crossed into its jump point and the stars stretched into long streaks of light around it, Threk found himself already looking forward to the next time he would see that little blue world again. Not as a graveyard this time, not as an abandoned fleet waiting quietly for someone to notice it, but as the beginning of something new, standing tall once more, awake at last, after its very long, very patient sleep. The jump to Kethran space took the better part of 2 weeks, plenty of time for Threk to think about everything that had happened, and about everything still to come. He spent a good part of the journey drafting his report to the Assembly, trying to find words that would do justice to what he had witnessed, without making it sound like the kind of wild story no sensible person would believe. In the end, he decided the plain truth, told simply, was more than enough. Dorn spent most of the trip going back over the recordings and data fragments they had collected, still fascinated by the old ship, the strange language, and the long, careful history of a species that had refused to disappear, even when the galaxy had assumed they already had. He had already started compiling notes for what he jokingly called his own personal history of Earth, though Threk suspected there was nothing joking about how seriously his engineer actually took the project. Sella, for her part, spent a good deal of the trip simply staring out at the stars, quieter than usual, though not unhappily so. When Threk asked her about it one evening, she only shrugged. "Just thinking," she said, "about how close we came to flying right past that system without a second glance. If you hadn't decided to buy those old star charts from that dying trader, none of this would have happened." We'd have never known any of it. Sentinel would still be sitting out there alone, and Earth would still be waiting for someone who never showed up. Would have been a shame, Threk agreed, though I suspect Sentinel would have kept waiting regardless. It struck me as the patient type. Patient enough to wait forever? Threk thought about that for a long moment before answering. I don't know, but I'm glad we didn't make it have to find out. When the long reach finally arrived back in Kethrin space, and Threk stood before the Assembly's council to deliver his report in person, he watched their faces carefully as he described the fleet, the battle, and the quiet, patient guardian that had tested them all so carefully, before finally, cautiously, deciding to trust them. Some of the council members looked skeptical. Others looked frightened, the way people often did when confronted with a power far greater than their own. But a few, the ones who mattered most, looked something closer to hopeful, already turning their minds toward what a partnership with a species like that might someday mean for the Kethran people. Threk left the council chamber that day without a clear answer about what would happen next, whether the Assembly would embrace the offered alliance, or hesitate, or find some cautious middle path between the two. But he found, walking back out into the familiar streets of his own homeworld under a sky he had known his whole life, that he wasn't especially worried about it either way. He had done what he set out to do. He had found something far greater than salvage. He had found a story worth telling, a promise worth keeping, and a small, quiet part in the beginning of something the whole galaxy would likely be talking about for a very long time to come. Whatever happened next, humanity was awake again, and Threk Dassin, salvager, captain of a small and unremarkable ship called the Long Reach, had been there to see it happen. That, he decided, watching the twin moons rise over his homeworld that night, was more than enough for one lifetime. And somewhere out among the stars, a great blue world was finally beginning to stir again, ready, at long last, to welcome its children home.